You think you know what a medieval battle looked like? Think again. Hollywood gave us knights in gleaming armor, noble speeches, and clean sword fights. But the real thing, it was muddy, chaotic, loud, and smelled like blood, sweat, and raw fear. No slow motion, no epic music, just panic, strategy, and survival. In this video, we're going deep into what medieval battles actually felt like, and fair warning, it's not nearly as glamorous as you've been told. The sun's gone down, and so has the mood. Soldiers huddle around flickering campfires, their armor stacked beside them, their nerves doing all the talking. No one's really sleeping tonight. Not well. You hear whispered prayers, awkward jokes, and someone softly vomiting into a bush. The air smells like damp wool, wood smoke, and the sour tang of fear. Welcome to the night before a medieval battle. It's less Braveheart, and more camping trip gone terribly, terribly wrong. Forget the fantasy of warriors polishing swords and bonding over ale. Tonight, you're lucky if your cloak's not soaked and your boots aren't crawling with something alive. Most men sleep in shifts, curled like question marks beneath makeshift tents. If they even have tents. If you're a noble, sure, maybe you've got a padded bedroll and someone to rub your feet. But if you're a foot soldier, you're spooning a rock for warmth and hoping it doesn't snow. The silence is the worst part. Between crackling fires and muttered prayers, there's a loud, gnawing quiet. You try not to think about the morning, about your odds, about the man whose skull you might have to split open with a rusty axe. You think instead about home. Your wife, your dog. That one time you ate a pear and it wasn't rotten. Anything to not imagine what it feels like when a blade gets stuck in someone's ribs. Over at the command tent, things aren't much calmer. The Lord in charge is surrounded by half-sober advisors arguing about formations, battle maps, and how to deal with that one guy who lost the siege ladders. Someone suggests prayer. Someone else suggests more wine. Nobody agrees on much, except that they're all terrified. These aren't superhero generals. They're just men, some barely literate, trying to remember if they're supposed to fight uphill or not. Back in the ranks, the mood shifts between gallows humor and grim silence. A few soldiers crack jokes that wouldn't make sense outside a battlefield. "If I die tomorrow, tell my goat she gets the farm." Someone laughs. No one laughs back. A man nearby is sharpening a blade on a whetstone, eyes blank. The sound grates on your nerves, too clean, too final. It's the sound of morning creeping closer. There are no dramatic speeches, no banners flapping majestically in the night breeze. Just men urinating behind bushes and wondering how many hours they've got left to breathe. Someone starts singing, a half-remembered tavern song from home. It catches on. Drunkenly, badly, but it helps. Music gives the illusion of control. A tiny act of defiance against the chaos waiting just over the hill. Some men try to sleep, others just sit with their backs to trees, blinking at the stars and doing rough math in their heads. If I stay behind the guy with the big shield, maybe I won't die. Unless he dies. Then I'm next. The logic isn't sound, but neither is the plan. You wrap your cloak tighter, pretend your heart isn't pounding, and ignore the unmistakable sound of someone crying in the dark. Food's no comfort either. Rations are hard bread, cold broth, or something your neighbor swears used to be a turnip. You eat because you have to, not because you want to. Besides, you've got to be careful. A full stomach on a battlefield? That's a quick ticket to throwing up in your helmet. And once you start vomiting in battle, the odds of survival go from slim to hilarious. Somewhere, a scout returns with word on the enemy's movement. "They've lit their campfires," he says, which is both helpful and completely useless. Everyone already assumed they would. Still, the announcement makes the rounds, as if it changes anything. It doesn't. The only thing that matters is dawn. That's when everything stops being hypothetical and starts being bloody. You glance at your weapon, still dirty from last week's skirmish. You could clean it, but instead, you just stare at it. You wonder who it might kill tomorrow, or whether it'll break in half on the first swing. Maybe you'll drop it. Maybe you'll freeze. Maybe you'll run. You wouldn't be the first. That thought, oddly enough, is a little comforting. Some men write letters. Others whisper goodbyes to no one. If there's a priest in camp, he's busy giving last rites to the living, just in case. Superstition runs high. You touch a charm your mother gave you. Someone else mutters about birds being bad omens. Another ties a rabbit's foot to their belt. Whatever gets you through the night. Eventually, you close your eyes, not because you're sleepy, but because you're tired of being awake. The ground is cold. Your muscles ache. You know what's coming. And somehow, the waiting is worse. When the sky starts to turn gray and the first horn sounds, you won't feel ready. You'll just feel real. Because in the morning, you don't rise as a hero. You rise as a target. The sun's barely up, and already the camp is a mess of movement. Men rubbing sleep from their eyes, shivering as dew clings to their cloaks. Armor clinks like wind chimes in a funeral procession. But while most are fumbling for helmets and hard bread, one particular corner of camp is busy pretending to be important. The command tent. And inside, the least glamorous scene in medieval military history. A war council that could double as a shouting match. You'd expect strategy. Maps. Thoughtful leaders. Instead, it's a bunch of men standing around a table, pointing at lines they don't fully understand. "We flank from the left," one insists, stabbing the parchment. "No, we wait for their cavalry to overextend," argues another. In truth, none of them have slept. Half are hungover, and one lord hasn't bathed since spring. They're deciding the fate of hundreds with the same confidence as gamblers in a tavern. Some commanders love to overcomplicate things. Double envelopment maneuvers, deceptive feints, strategic withdrawals. It all sounds brilliant on parchment. But when you're dealing with muddy hills, panicked horses, and hungry conscripts who barely know left from right, it's mostly wishful thinking. Plans fall apart the moment the first horn sounds. But that won't stop them from pretending this is all under control. It isn't. In another part of camp, the rank and file gather for pep talks, though that term is generous. If you're lucky, your captain gives a grizzled speech about courage, honor, and how your ancestors are watching. If you're not lucky, it's just "don't die," followed by an awkward silence. Either way, the effect is mostly psychological theater. You clap, not because you're inspired, but because everyone else is clapping and you don't want to look weird. These speeches are rarely original. Most are recycled from previous battles or borrowed from songs. Some captains just scream about glory until they go hoarse. Others quote scripture they half remember. A few try humor. "Kill fast, die slower," one bellows. The men laugh. Sort of. Morale is fragile, like old bread, and just as likely to crack under pressure. Meanwhile, behind the tents and barrels, a different kind of war is already underway. The great morning chicken theft. Food is scarce, rations are terrible, and someone, somewhere, has a live chicken in a crate. You don't know how it got here. You don't care. You just know it's meat. And meat before battle is the difference between courage and cramping up mid-charge. Enter the thief, a wiry young soldier with too much adrenaline and not enough conscience. He slips past the cook fire, quietly lifts the crate, and disappears behind a latrine. 10 minutes later, a suspiciously roasted smell wafts through camp. No one says a word. No one dares. That chicken is gone, vanished into bellies and shared guilt. The cook will blame the dog. There is no dog. Some men sharpen their blades, others check their gear, but everyone keeps one eye on the horizon. The sun's higher now. The air is warming. You can feel tension ripple through the camp like an incoming storm. That eerie quiet settles again, like the earth itself is holding its breath. Somewhere, a drummer begins a steady beat. Boom, boom, boom. That's not for rhythm. That's to tell you, it's almost time. Back in the command tent, final orders are barked. Messengers sprint off like terrified pigeons, clutching scraps of parchment they hope won't get them stabbed for asking questions. Horses are saddled, flags are raised, and someone's yelling about missing arrows. Again, it's always arrows. They're either bent, soaked, or stolen by another unit. Supply lines in medieval war were less like lines and more like suggestions. The lord of the army finally emerges, wrapped in polished steel and self-importance. He climbs onto his horse, raises a gauntleted fist, and delivers the final pre-battle address. It's passionate, it's loud, it's mostly nonsense. For honor, for kingdom, for that one pig farm we're apparently fighting over. Everyone cheers, not because they believe it, but because the sooner this starts, the sooner it ends. There's one last check of weapons, one last shared glance between friends. You try to remember if your sword is still slightly chipped. It is. You wonder if it matters. It doesn't. Someone throws up again. Someone else mumbles a prayer. And then, suddenly, a trumpet pierces the morning air. High, sharp, final. That's the signal. No more speeches, no more maps. Just you, the mud, and whatever's waiting over the ridge. And with that, the army begins to move. Not like a movie charge, more like a sluggish, armor-clad parade of nerves and regret. Banners flutter, feet stomp, and your stomach drops straight into your boots. You're not ready. No one is. But ready or not, the battlefield is calling. And whatever happens next, at least you got a bite of that stolen chicken. Long before swords clash or arrows fly, there's a much crueler enemy: distance. Getting an army to a battlefield was often more painful than the fighting itself. You didn't just arrive at war, you dragged yourself to it, for miles. Through forests, over hills, across ankle-snapping rocks, and mud that could swallow a cartwheel whole. The march wasn't a noble procession. It was a slow, soggy, shuffling descent into physical and emotional breakdown. Let's start with shoes. Or rather, the sad leather excuses for shoes most soldiers wore. Medieval footwear was barely better than a wet paper bag with laces. No arch support, no waterproofing. If it rained, and it always rained, you walked in puddles. All day. Socks? Not guaranteed. Blisters? Constant. Some men wrapped their feet in cloth, others in prayer. Everyone ended up limping. And if your boot split mid-march, congratulations. You're now walking on gravel with a meat sock. Armor didn't help. A full suit of chainmail could weigh anywhere from 20 to 50 pounds. Add a helmet, a shield, a sword, and maybe a spear strapped to your back. Now walk 10 miles in the rain, on 2 meals of dried beans and anxiety. You're a human stew pot, chafing in places you didn't know could chafe. And the worst part? If you died, they'd probably just strip the armor and pass it on. No refunds. The march was slow, not just because of terrain, but because medieval armies carried everything. Tents, food, spare weapons, barrels of water, medical kits, which were mostly just saws, siege gear, and chickens, some of which were eaten early, some of which mysteriously disappeared. Picture a traveling town made entirely of mud, noise, and stress. And leading the way, a scout who's 60% sure he knows where the enemy actually is. Communication was another headache. No radios, no walkie-talkies. Orders were shouted, relayed, misheard, repeated, and often completely wrong by the time they reached the rear. You might be marching north when you were supposed to go west. Half the army might take a wrong turn and end up in a swamp, and by the time the error was noticed, morale was already bleeding out somewhere near your last blister. Let's talk about rain. Medieval rain wasn't a romantic drizzle. It was endless, cold, and it ruined everything. Tents leaked, food spoiled, arrows warped, horses slipped, rivers flooded. That bridge you planned to cross? Gone. And with it, your timetable. You'd camp in the open, soaked to the bone, clinging to a piece of wet bread and hoping it was just bread. At least the lice were warm. They loved wet hair. If the mud didn't get you, the carts might. Supply wagons were pulled by oxen or half-starved horses, and those animals had zero interest in heroics. They'd stop when they wanted, turn when they shouldn't, and collapse without warning. Every army had at least one poor fool yelling at livestock with tears in his eyes. And when a cart broke a wheel, everyone stopped. For hours. Because nothing in medieval war moved faster than despair. Now food. If you weren't lucky enough to loot a village or steal a chicken, you were eating rations. Hard bread, old cheese, and dried beans so chewy they could double as arrowheads. Water was carried in barrels that hadn't been cleaned since last season. Wine was safer if you had it, but only the nobles did. Everyone else played stomach roulette with every sip, hoping not to spend the next march vomiting behind a bush. Insects were ever present. Gnats in your eyes, flies on your food, fleas in your tunic, and ticks in places you don't discuss unless you're dying. It wasn't just discomfort. It was a slow drain on your sanity. Pair that with sunburn, trench foot, and the constant clanging of gear, and you had the kind of experience modern boot camps would call psychologically inadvisable. And still, through all that, you had to look like you knew what you were doing. Officers barked orders to keep formation, even though the guy beside you hadn't slept. The one ahead of you was missing a shoe, and the guy behind you kept muttering to a lucky rock. If you fell behind, good luck. Stragglers were easy pickings for bandits or enemy scouts. Some just vanished. Nobody went back for them. Eventually, after days of this torment, someone would point at a hill and say, "That's it. The battlefield." You'd expected something grand, open plains, dramatic backdrops, maybe a castle in the distance. Instead, it was just more mud, maybe a ruined village, and the faint smell of manure. This was where you'd fight. This is what you marched for, and somehow, you still weren't ready. As the army began to form ranks, you looked around. At the blisters, the broken boots, the tired eyes, the rain still spitting from the sky. You'd already endured more suffering than most men could bear, and the fighting hadn't even started yet. You've arrived, somehow. Your feet feel like spoiled fruit, your armor's digging into your collarbone, and your only clear thought is, now what? The answer? Stand around, a lot. The moments before battle aren't swift or cinematic. They're long, awkward, and filled with squinting at flags you can barely identify. Is that our banner or theirs? Someone asks. Looks like a goat. Ours has a bear. That might be a bear or a very aggressive dog. Identifying your own army was half the battle. Heraldry was the medieval version of color coding, only with far more animals, weapons, and family grudges involved. But here's the problem. Mud, rain, smoke, and your nearsightedness. Shields and flags got filthy, emblems blurred, and suddenly you're marching behind what you think is your captain's standard, only to realize it's the enemy's, and you've just politely joined their flank. Even experienced commanders struggled with orientation. "Which way is north?" someone shouts. "Where's the river?" "Didn't we pass that tree an hour ago?" Medieval battlefields had no clear markers, no grid maps. They were organic chaos, full of sudden hills, ditches, and inconvenient livestock. Scouts tried to offer updates, but they were usually guessing. "They're over the ridge," one says. "Which ridge?" "The one with grass." Helpful. Forming up was a test of patience. Officers barked orders. "Archers here! Spearmen there! No, not that way." Entire formations would shuffle awkwardly like villagers at a wedding line dance. Some men tripped, others got trampled. If you were in the back ranks, you could barely see the enemy, let alone hear what was going on. Your job was to stand still, act brave, and not faint from the smell of the guy next to you. Speaking of smells, it wasn't just sweat and fear. Battlefields had a specific perfume: manure, wet leather, old blood, and anxiety. Horses defecated nervously. So did some men. You might be clutching your sword with grim resolve, while your stomach loudly questioned your life choices. No one talked about it, but a great many warriors entered battle with, let's say, unfortunate trousers. Then came the noise, trumpets, drums, horns, shouts. Some of it was meant to intimidate the enemy. Most of it was just trying to signal something to someone, somewhere. The problem? Half the army couldn't hear over the chaos, so orders got misinterpreted. Advance became hold. Flank became retreat. And suddenly a dozen men were running the wrong way, causing an accidental charge or a premature rout. Even vision couldn't be trusted. If the sun hit at the wrong angle, you were blinded. If it rained, mud splattered your eyes. If there was fog, you could lose your entire left wing in it. It wasn't uncommon for entire units to vanish into low mist, only to reappear mid-fight, confused and stabbing at whoever was closest. The battlefield wasn't just hostile, it was disorienting. Then there were the banners. Every commander had one. Some were high-quality silk, others were little more than rags on sticks. Either way, they were your lifeline. Lose sight of your banner, and you might as well be a solo adventurer in a forest full of bears. But again, mud, blood, smoke, and everyone else's identical-looking flags made it hard to keep track. "That's our banner, right?" you whisper. Right? Commanders tried to stay visible, often perched on hills with attendants holding large flags like overachieving cheerleaders. This made them excellent targets for enemy archers. So they moved. A lot. Which meant your orders also moved. Sometimes away from you. Sometimes into the thick of things. And if your commander died, well, best of luck. The chain of command turned into a game of telephone played during an earthquake. To keep things orderly, armies sometimes used code signals. A horn blast for retreat, 2 for charge, 3 for form up. But horns broke. People panicked. And sometimes the horn blower got an arrow in the chest mid-note. The result? A charge that should have been a retreat. A flank that became a direct assault. And a line of soldiers asking each other, did that mean go? Some men brought personal tokens to help orient themselves. Ribbons, charms, or colorful feathers. These were supposed to keep them linked to their unit. But they also made them easier to spot. If you were wearing a bright red sash in a field of mud-colored confusion, you were basically saying, stab me first. Still, some took the risk. A little color was worth the chance of staying alive and being remembered. And finally, just as you think you figured out where you're supposed to stand, someone yells, "They're moving!" Everyone stiffens, heads turn, shields raise, and a ripple of confusion spreads through the ranks like a slow-moving cough. Are they charging? Are we charging? Or is this just another false alarm caused by a herd of sheep fleeing the noise? Nobody knows. But the next chapter? That's when confusion becomes combat. You finally lock eyes with the enemy. You're standing in formation, hands sweating around your weapon, knees pretending not to shake. You've seen illustrations, duels, heroic stances, elegant swordplay. Let that go. Because the moment this battle starts, it's not about honor, style, or choreographed sword moves. It's about one thing, hitting the other guy before he hits you. And you know what really helps with that? A good, solid mace. Swords may get all the glory, but they weren't the go-to weapon for everyone. For one thing, swords were expensive. For another, they weren't exactly built for punching through armor. Enter the mace. A blunt, brain-rattling club made of metal and resentment. You didn't need finesse. You just needed aim. And a strong enough swing to turn someone's helmet into a rattle. It was a weapon of the practical. And the permanently annoyed. The movies lied. Sword fights in real medieval combat weren't duels. They were fast, frantic, and incredibly short. Most lasted seconds. There were no flourishes, no witty remarks, no slow-motion dodges. Just 2 men swinging at each other with everything they had, hoping one of them missed. If your sword didn't connect, you shoved. If that didn't work, you kicked. If that failed, you screamed and bit and grabbed a rock. Armor complicated things. A slash that could kill an unarmored man might just bounce off a knight. That's why many went for the joints, The armpits, the groin, the back of the knee. Not exactly glamorous targets, but highly effective. Some used warhammers to spike through plate. Others used axes for chopping power. But the mace? That was your insurance policy. No blade, no edge, no problem. Just cave something in. Let's talk about battlefield etiquette, because there wasn't any. If a knight fell, you didn't wait for him to get up. You pounced. You stabbed through the eye slit. You drove your blade through his armpit. You kicked him in the ribs until he stopped moving. This wasn't a jousting tournament. No points were awarded for chivalry, only for not dying. Weapon choices varied wildly. A peasant might be swinging a sharpened shovel. A mercenary might use a flanged mace with cruel spikes. Some had falchions, heavy, one-edged swords made more for hacking than slicing. Others carried polearms, halberds, or even a modified pitchfork. If it could puncture, bash, or chop, it was welcome on the field. You didn't need elegance. You needed results. Close combat wasn't clean. Picture a mass of sweaty, armored bodies colliding like a riot in a metal scrapyard. There's pushing, screaming, slipping, trampling. You might not even see the man who wounds you. Someone swings from behind. Someone else grabs your ankle. Your shield is knocked aside, and now you're face to face with a mace, and then stars. If you're lucky. There were no perfect techniques. Most soldiers didn't have years of training. They learned by surviving. Swing low, keep moving, don't get flanked, aim for the soft bits. And if your weapon got stuck in someone's body, well, you either let go or kicked it free. Some carried a dagger as backup. Some just screamed and punched. There's a reason so many medieval combat injuries involved broken fingers and cracked skulls. One underrated battlefield tactic: tripping. If you could knock a man down, he became an easy target. Soldiers used their shields to shove, their boots to sweep legs, and their shoulders to ram. Once someone was on the ground, the fight was over, at least for him. Stomping wasn't dishonorable. It was efficient. And it kept your own armor a little cleaner. The noise of battle didn't sound like metal clashing in harmony. It was messy, wet, crunchy, bone snapping, men screaming, shields splintering, horses shrieking. You didn't hear a symphony, you heard panic. Someone beside you might be sobbing. Someone else might be howling in rage. And over it all, the dull thud of a mace finding a helmet. Over and over and over. If your weapon broke, you picked up another. Maybe from the ground, maybe from someone who no longer needed it. If you lost your shield, you grabbed a plank. If you lost your nerve, well, that's when things really got dangerous. Because running in armor? That's just falling in slow motion, and no one wants to be caught mid-fall when a mace is coming. So forget what you've seen in dramas. There were no elegant duels under a banner, no pause for honor, no tip of the blade before combat. Just mud, noise, pain, and the blunt reality of a mace swinging toward your face. You're in the thick of it now. Sword in hand, mud in your teeth, chaos all around. You thought battle would be organized, line versus line, knight versus knight. It's not. It's a sweaty, screaming, slipping mess. And the first thing you learn? There's no such thing as a cheap shot. There's only who's still standing when the screaming stops. And the guy who survives? He gouged, he bit, he kicked, and he absolutely did not fight fair. Medieval warfare didn't come with rules. Sure, nobles loved to talk about chivalry and the honor of battle, but that usually only applied after someone was dead, or if the loser was rich enough to ransom. For everyone else, survival meant doing whatever it took. Groin kicks? Of course. Dirt in the eyes? Please. Pretending to surrender and then stabbing someone? It happened. A lot. In a world where helmets blocked vision and armor limited movement, fighters used every dirty trick they could. You'd trip a guy, knee him in the gut, and bash his head before he got up. You'd pretend to stumble, then jab your dagger into his thigh. Some men smeared pig fat on their weapons to make wounds harder to treat. Others tied bells to confuse enemy horses. Creativity was encouraged. Just don't die. Let's talk about eye gouging. Yes, it happened. A lot. In the middle of a brawl, if your fingers could reach through a visor slit, you didn't hesitate. Was it honorable? Absolutely not. Was it effective? Extremely. Some knights even filed their gauntlet fingertips for better grip. That's not battle, it's nightmare fuel. Hair pulling, only if your opponent still had hair. Kicking someone when they're down, mandatory. Using their shield against them, perfectly valid. If you saw a guy struggling to get up, you didn't offer a hand, you offered a boot. The battlefield didn't reward sportsmanship. It rewarded aggression, speed, and cruelty. Mercy was for monks, and even they carried knives sometimes. Weapons were only one part of the equation. Your body was the other. Elbows, knees, fists, all fair game. If your sword got knocked away, your next best weapon was whatever you could swing. A helmet, a chunk of wood, even a rock. Soldiers didn't train to look elegant. They trained to win. And sometimes winning looked like punching someone in the throat and stealing their shoes. There was no pause for injury. If you slipped, you got trampled. If you hesitated, you got stabbed. If you dropped your weapon, you didn't stop to pick it up, unless you wanted to feel steel between your shoulder blades. The pace was frantic, clumsy, desperate. You didn't have time to think, only to react. 1 second too slow, and you were just another corpse in the mud. Shields weren't just for blocking. They were battering rams. Men smashed with them, edged them into throats, and shoved with all their weight to topple enemies. Some shields even had spikes. And yes, those spikes were used. Up close, a shield bash to the jaw could knock a man out cold, or knock his teeth out, or both. If someone got tangled in your legs, you stomped. If they grabbed your arm, you bit them. Knights weren't above it. They might have looked regal in their polished plate, but when someone's clawing at your throat with a broken dagger, you stop caring about etiquette. Blood makes everyone equal, especially when it's yours. And here's a fun detail. People faked injuries. Some would collapse and play dead, waiting for a chance to ambush the next fool who looked away. Others screamed like they were mortally wounded, then leapt up to stab an unsuspecting enemy. Drama skills weren't just for bards. On the battlefield, they could save your life. Even the environment became a weapon. Mud was flung, rocks were tossed, bodies were used as cover. Fallen soldiers created uneven terrain, which could trip horses or trap feet. Some fighters dragged enemies down just to make them easier to finish. It was brutal, it was dirty, and it was exactly what everyone expected. When the dust settled, those left standing weren't the most noble. They were the most ruthless, the most creative, the most willing to abandon everything they'd been taught about how real warriors fight. Because in medieval war, there were no points for style, only survival. And the ones who lived? They fought dirty. But around here, that was just called fighting. Let's talk about armor. That shining suit of perfection you've seen in paintings? It exists. But what you don't see is the man inside, sweating buckets, chafing in places we won't name and praying he doesn't fall over. Armor was advanced for its time, sure, but it wasn't magic. It didn't make you invincible. It made you clanky, tired, and very much still bleedable. Just a bit harder to open up, like a walking can. Knights were the tanks of their day, but even tanks break. Full plate armor could weigh up to 60 pounds, give or take. Chainmail, a little less, but still enough to make stairs your mortal enemy. Wearing that all day was like being wrapped in a metallic oven. Your breath echoed in your helmet. Your vision was narrow, and you had zero peripheral awareness. Surprise. You're fighting blind and sweaty. Now armor did protect you, from slashes, stabs, and sometimes arrows. It made you harder to kill, but not impossible. A well-placed hammer swing could dent your ribs. A spear to the neck opening, fatal. A dagger shoved under your arm where the plates didn't overlap. Game over. The human body is full of joints, and armor had to leave room to move. And those gaps, warriors knew exactly where to aim. And let's not pretend everyone had full armor. That was expensive. Most soldiers wore what they could afford, maybe a mail shirt, a helmet, some padded cloth. If you were lucky, a pair of gauntlets. If not, a prayer. Poorer fighters wrapped themselves in boiled leather or padded gambesons, which helped against slashes, but not much else. Against a mace or a morning star, they might as well have worn paper. Heat was a hidden enemy. Battlefields weren't air-conditioned. Wearing armor in summer meant you were cooking yourself, literally. There are historical accounts of men collapsing from heat exhaustion before the battle even started. You'd sweat through your undershirt, then your padding, and suddenly your skin would feel like soup. Dehydration was just a prelude to heat stroke and fainting in battle. That was how your story ended, flat, sizzling, and helpless. Mobility? Better than people think, but still awkward. A trained knight could run, even mount a horse while armored. But tripping was always a danger. If you fell in plate, you could get up, unless your arm was pinned or someone was standing on you. And good luck if you fell face first into mud. You'd need help, fast. Otherwise, you might drown in your own helmet. That's not a joke. That's a real thing that happened. Pain was constant. Armor rubbed raw against your skin. Bruises formed even without breaking the surface. A blow that didn't pierce could still knock the wind out of you, or fracture a bone underneath. Imagine getting hit with a bat while wearing a trash can. Now imagine it happening repeatedly, with the added bonus of screaming, fire, and horses. Not exactly a glamorous day out. Helmets were the worst. Yes, they protected your brain. But they were also heavy, muffled your hearing, restricted your breathing, and fogged up if you exhaled wrong. Visibility was reduced to a slit or two, just enough to see your doom approaching. Some helmets were so tight, you couldn't turn your head. So if something was coming from the side, you didn't see it. You felt it, usually in the ribs. Getting in and out of armor wasn't quick. You needed help, squires if you had them. Strapping it on could take 20 minutes or more. Taking it off, even longer if your hands were shaking or your armor was bent. In battle, if something came loose, tough luck. You weren't stopping to adjust your shin guards while someone was trying to split your skull. And here's the kicker. Once you were wounded, armor became a trap. Blood pooled inside. Cuts were hidden. Infection spread under the padding. If you collapsed, you might not be able to get it off fast enough to treat anything. In some cases, knights died because their comrades couldn't remove the armor in time. Death by over-engineering. Oops. So yes, armor was revolutionary. It changed warfare. But it didn't turn men into superheroes. It just gave them a little more time, a little more hope, and a lot more sweat. Because in the end, even the most glorious knight was still just a man trying to stay upright in a tin suit while the world fell apart around him. In every medieval movie, the knight charges forward on a noble steed, graceful, fearless, majestic. But reality, those horses were terrified, and rightly so. Because on the battlefield, horses weren't just transportation. They were targets, big, loud, and vital. And that made them enemy priority number one. If you wanted to stop a knight, you didn't swing at the knight. You took out the legs of his ride. Fast. War horses were trained for combat, but they weren't machines. They spooked. They panicked. They threw riders. Sure, they could charge into battle, trample enemies, and crash through lines, but only if everything went exactly right. And let's be honest, when does anything go exactly right in medieval war? One arrow, one spear, one misstep. That's all it took to send both horse and rider tumbling like a sack of angry potatoes. Let's talk size. Medieval war horses were strong, but not as massive as modern depictions suggest. They were stocky, muscular, and bred for stamina and stability. Think draft horse, not racehorse. They carried armored men, sometimes in armor themselves. That's hundreds of pounds, running full speed into a mess of mud, pikes, and screaming. You know what doesn't love that scenario? The horse. Horses were smart. They knew danger. They didn't want to charge into a forest of spear tips any more than you do. Cavalry charges worked best when the enemy panicked and broke formation. But if the foot soldiers held their ground, if the spears stayed level, horses balked. They slowed. They refused. And that hesitation, that was enough to turn a glorious charge into a clumsy, bloody disaster. Pike formations were cavalry's worst nightmare. Rows of soldiers with long spears braced into the ground, ready to gut whatever approached. A horse running into that didn't just die, it collapsed, impaling itself while flinging its rider into a storm of blades. Knights might survive the fall, but many didn't. And the horse? It never stood a chance. It was a four-legged sacrifice in a steel ritual. Missile troops targeted horses, too. Archers and crossbowmen aimed low. A bolt through the chest, an arrow through the neck. It didn't take much. Once a horse went down, it took the knight with it, trapped under its bulk, pinned by stirrups, or flung into enemy ranks with no time to draw a second breath. And that's if you weren't crushed by your own dying mount. Even friendly terrain posed risks. Horses slipped in mud, stumbled in ditches, broke legs in holes. A sprained ankle for a knight meant limping. For a horse, it meant death. No medieval battlefield had a vet on standby. If your horse went down and couldn't get back up, the only mercy was a quick blade to the throat. And even that didn't always happen. Cavalry riders carried short swords or maces for close combat, but many also carried mercy daggers, for themselves or their horses. No one wanted to leave a wounded mount screaming on the field, but sometimes they did. Sometimes there wasn't time. And as you ran forward, you passed the bodies, limp, crushed, steaming in the cold morning air. You didn't look twice. You couldn't afford to. War horses weren't just tools. They were comrades. Knights named them, bonded with them, trained with them for years. Losing your horse was like losing a limb, or a brother. You didn't just lose mobility, you lost part of yourself. And in the chaos, there was no moment to grieve. Only the sound of another trumpet and another charge. And yes, horses fought back. They kicked, bit, trampled. Some were armored with steel barding covering their heads and flanks. But even armored, they were vulnerable. A single pike to the chest, a stumble onto a jagged rock, a panicked bolt in the wrong direction. And that was it. Over. And with them, often, went the knight's last hope of staying alive. So the next time you picture a knight thundering into battle, don't just watch the man. Watch the horse. See the flared nostrils, the wide eyes, the pounding hooves trying to outrun death. Because in medieval war, the horses died first. And often, they died harder than anyone else. Not every soldier on the field was a knight. In fact, most weren't. They were peasants, farmers, fishermen, dung collectors. Men who'd been handed a weapon, sometimes that same day, and told to stand still, point it forward, and try not to die. You weren't trained. You weren't ready. You were a warm body in a tunic. And today, you were being asked to help stop an army. You held a pike in your calloused hands and prayed. The pike was your friend, a long, awkward stick of sharp determination. Sometimes 15 feet long, it wasn't elegant. It was a wall. You stood shoulder to shoulder, planted the butt of your pike in the dirt, and braced. It was teamwork or nothing. If even one guy slipped, the line buckled. And once the line buckled, it was like a zipper of doom unfastening through your ranks. Hold the line. That was your one job. You weren't armored. Maybe you had a helmet, if the Lord was feeling generous. More likely you wore a padded jacket, if that. Your best defense was the men beside you. Shoulder to shoulder, pike to pike. If the line held, you lived. If it broke, you died. Your feet were sore. Your back ached, and your spear was so long it wobbled with every breath. But still, you stood. Because the alternative was running, and you didn't want to run. Not because of cowardice, because of physics. If you turned your back in a formation, you became an obstacle. You tripped the guy behind you. You broke the rhythm. And worst of all, you opened a hole. Enemies loved holes. Holes were invitations. Invitations to stab, slice, and turn your carefully planted pike wall into a meat grinder. So you stayed, you gritted your teeth, and you held. Commanders didn't know your name. You were a unit, a body. You didn't get strategy, just orders. Move forward, move faster, hold ground. No one asked how you felt. No one cared that you hadn't slept. Your stomach growled, your legs trembled. But you weren't alone. That was the one comfort. Dozens, maybe hundreds of men just like you. Terrified, hungry, and gripping a stick like their lives depended on it. Because they did. The guy next to you might have been your neighbor, or your cousin, or a guy you hated last week but now love because he's not currently trying to stab you. You exchanged nods, silent promises. I'll watch your side, you watch mine. That was medieval solidarity, not forged in glory but in dirt and desperation. It wasn't about winning, it was about not collapsing first. Pike formations were terrifying to charge at, and just as terrifying to be in. Horses bearing down, arrows overhead. You had no shield. You ducked, flinched, screamed. But you didn't move. Because if you did, the guy behind you shoved you back into place, not out of cruelty, out of survival. Everyone's life depended on everyone else. So you steadied your pike, you braced your feet, and you waited. When the cavalry came, it felt like thunder. The ground shook. Men whispered prayers. The sergeant shouted, "Hold!" and you prayed your feet wouldn't slip. Then, impact. Horses met spikes. Men screamed. Splinters flew. Your arms jolted. The man beside you went down. You didn't look. You couldn't. You shoved your pike forward and hoped the thing in front of you was enemy and not friend. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the charge broke. The horses turned, the enemy scattered. And you lived. Other times, the line collapsed. You were pulled down, trampled, speared, or crushed beneath bodies. Maybe you crawled away. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you pretended to be dead and hoped nobody noticed. You weren't a hero. You were just there. That's all it took to earn a grave. When the enemy fell back, you didn't cheer. You didn't move. You reset. You checked your grip. You searched for the next wave. Because there was always a next wave. And as long as you were standing, you were expected to keep standing. That was the role. Not to charge. Not to shout. Just stand. In the mud. In the fear. And hope your side was slightly less exhausted than theirs. So forget glory. Forget fame. If you were lucky, your name might be remembered by your village. If not, you were a bloodstain on a field of thousands. But you mattered. Your pike mattered. Because without the line, the whole army fell. You were the wall, the barrier, the foot soldier. And on the worst days of medieval war, you were hope. If standing in formation was terrifying, actually fighting in one was something else entirely. You weren't just battling the enemy, you were battling the ground beneath you, the man beside you, and your own screaming instincts. Because when the charge came, when the front lines met and pikes shattered, it wasn't heroic. It was horrifying. Fear wasn't just present, it was everywhere. In your legs, your chest, your throat. And you fought anyway. Noise hit you like a wall. The clash of weapons, the cries of the wounded, the orders shouted from somewhere you couldn't see. Armor clanged, bones cracked. Arrows screamed through the air. You couldn't hear your thoughts, let alone commands. And your heartbeat, that was its own war drum, thudding in your ears like a death toll. Everyone yelled, partly to communicate, mostly to not break under the pressure. You didn't see a clear opponent. You saw flashes, an axe swing here, a shield slam there. Movement blurred by panic, faces snarling through cracked helmets, blood spattering across cloth, someone screaming something that might have been a name, or just a sound. You didn't duel. You flailed, you stabbed, you shoved, and you hoped you weren't stabbing a friend. The ground betrayed you constantly. Between roots, rocks, churned up soil, and limbs, yes, limbs, beneath your feet. Every step was a gamble. You slipped on blood. You fell on a discarded shield. You turned to retreat and tripped on a dead man's arm. And when you fell hard. No cushion, no time. Just impact and the terrifying realization that you were now below the chaos line. Corpses weren't just obstacles. They were warnings. You stepped over men you'd stood beside. You avoided eye contact with the open stares of the dead. Some were missing faces. Others were still twitching. You couldn't help them. You didn't dare pause. Because if you stopped, you became one of them. So you looked away, clenched your jaw, and kept swinging. Breathing was difficult. Between the shouting, the smoke, the dust, and the heat of too many bodies pressed too close, your lungs burned. You coughed. You gagged. The smell? Unforgettable. Sweat, blood, feces, rot. Sometimes all at once. You could tell how bad the day was by how bad the air tasted. And today, it tasted like metal and fear. You couldn't focus on the big picture. Strategy didn't matter here. Lines were breaking. Men ran past you. Others collapsed at your feet. You looked for movement, anything swinging in your direction. That was your world. 6 feet wide, 2 feet deep. Anything outside of that was someone else's problem, until it became yours. When the front pushed forward, you pushed. When it staggered, you dug in. You didn't think. You reacted. You weren't fighting for glory. You were fighting because someone was swinging something heavy at your ribs, and you liked having ribs. You fought because someone else screamed, "Hold!" and you had nothing better to do than obey. You learned fast. Don't back up. You'll trip. Don't look down. You'll freeze. Don't scream. You'll waste air. Just move. Just swing. Just survive. You saw men break. Some dropped their weapons and bolted. Some cried. Some begged. Some just froze, dropped to their knees and waited for death. You couldn't help them. If you tried, you'd join them. Sometimes the chaos paused, briefly. Both sides regrouped. You took a breath. You checked your limbs. You spat blood and wiped your eyes. And then, it started again. A new wave. A fresh surge. The line closed again, and once more you were pressed between panic and violence, bracing for an impact you'd already survived once today. You didn't remember kills. You remembered moments. A boot stepping on your hand, a helmet rolling past, a man grabbing your leg as he bled out. You remembered the blur, the burn, the taste of blood in your mouth that might not have been yours. And when it was over, if you were lucky, you were still standing. And if you weren't, well, you joined the carpet of bodies being tripped over by the next terrified peasant gripping a pike and pretending he didn't see you. Because war didn't pause for the dead. It stomped over them again and again, until the mud was thick and no one could remember who they were. You hear it before you see it. A hiss, a whistle, then 100 tiny screams through the air. Arrows. The medieval battlefield's version of a divine warning. And it didn't matter who you were. Noble or peasant, mounted or marching, armored or shirtless. Those arrows had no bias. When the sky turned dark, every man looked up, muttered something panicked, and tried to shrink into the ground. Because when death falls from above, there's nowhere to run. Archers were the chaos gods of the battlefield. Positioned on hills, ridges, or behind infantry lines, they loosed volleys of arrows like they were feeding the wind with knives. The sky would ripple, literally darken, with hundreds of shafts cutting downward. Each one a tiny roulette wheel. Some hit shields, some hit dirt, some hit men. And the ones that hit men didn't always kill. Sometimes they just screamed on impact. Sometimes they got stuck. There was no cinematic thwack into a wooden shield, no graceful dodging. Arrows didn't ask permission. They tore through flesh, cracked bones, and impaled unlucky targets in horrible random ways. Shoulder, bleeding. Neck, down, eye, gone, thigh. You'd limp for life if you were lucky, People think archers were backline support, but on the battlefield they were storm clouds with sharp teeth. Most soldiers couldn't even see where the arrows came from. They just saw what they landed in. 1 second, your buddy's yelling something about formation. Next second, he's gasping through an arrow in the lung. You don't have time to mourn. You don't even have time to blink. You crouch, you shield, you pray, you move. Staying still made you a target. So did running. There was no right choice, just choices that hurt less. And forget the myth of armor making you invulnerable. Longbows and crossbows didn't care if you had metal on. A well-placed shot could punch through chainmail or slide under your plate. Some arrows pierced through joints. Others found necklines. You might survive the shot, only to die 3 days later from infection, or tetanus, or a barbed head that couldn't be pulled out without taking half your shoulder with it. The longbow was a monster. 6 feet of wood, a thick bowstring, and an archer who'd trained for years just to draw it properly. The English made it famous, but every culture had their version of death from range. Arrows weren't fired one at a time. They came in volleys. Waves meant not to kill you, but to kill someone. Someone nearby, someone in the way, someone you were counting on. Crossbows were slower, heavier, and easier to use. And they didn't need as much skill, just aim and pull. Their bolts could punch through armor like a crowbar through cardboard. You didn't need to be strong, just cruel. And they were so easy to reload. Entire units of crossbowmen could keep up a rhythm like a slow, painful drumbeat. Twang, twang, twang. Every beat brought another chance to die. The worst part wasn't the noise of the arrows. It was the silence before. That eerie lull. When the first volley hadn't landed yet. When the sky still held its breath. And then, impact, screams, grunts, metal splitting, horses panicking. The world exploded into agony for a few seconds, then reset, just long enough to do it all again. It wasn't one arrow that broke you. It was the 100 that followed. Commanders tried to protect their men. They gave orders to raise shields, hold formation, use terrain. Stay behind the ridge. Cover your heads. Close the ranks. But none of that guaranteed anything. Some men huddled behind fallen bodies. Others lay flat and pretended to be dead. It worked sometimes. Sometimes it made you an easier target. Arrows didn't play fair. They just fell. Veterans could hear the difference in arrow types. The heavier thud of a bodkin tip. The whirring zip of a broadhead. Some could tell how far the archers were by sound alone. But being able to recognize incoming death didn't make it less lethal. It just made you flinch sooner. Soldiers became twitchy, flinching at the wind, ducking at birds. When the sky becomes a weapon, it stays that way in your mind forever. So, if you ever hear someone talk about the romance of archery, heroic bowmen and elegant shots, just remember the battlefield. Remember the sky turning black, the man beside you clutching his neck, the sting of splinters through your shoulder. Because arrows weren't poetic, they were brutal, and they never cared who you were. The only thing worse than being hit by an arrow was waiting to be hit. And that's where the shield wall came in. Not just a tactic, not just a formation. It was a desperate group hug made of wood, iron, and shaking knees. You didn't stand behind your own shield. You stood behind his, and he stood behind yours. And you hoped, really hoped, that neither of you dropped it when the screaming started. A good shield wall wasn't neat. It was messy, gritty, loud. Soldiers crammed shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapped like roof tiles, some angled forward, some raised overhead. The point was to create a wall of no thank you for incoming projectiles. And it mostly worked. Mostly. Until someone slipped, or panicked, or the arrows came in low, fast, and didn't care about your geometry lesson. Holding a shield was a workout. It shook with every impact. Your arm ached, your fingers cramped. You couldn't see much. You couldn't do much. Just wait. Listen. Count the seconds between volleys. And pray. Not loudly, just under your breath. like a whispered apology to whatever God was supposed to be watching. Because in a shield wall, faith and fear shared space like breath and blood. There's a certain math that goes through your head in a moment like this. Not algebra, not battle math, survival math. How wide is the shield? How many can it cover? If he drops, will I be next? If I crouch behind him, do I get more protection? Or just make a better target? It's selfish math, panicked math, but it's real. And every man in the wall was doing it. Quietly, quickly, guiltily. Screams came in bursts, sometimes close, sometimes distant. And worse than the screams were the silences. When a man who was talking isn't anymore. When a thud hits the shield, and no one checks to see who it was meant for, you just grip the handle tighter, your knuckles white, your jaw locked. Because if you look, if you see it, that's when you lose it. And you can't lose it. Not now. You heard the arrows before they arrived, a soft rushing sound. Then the hammering impact of wood and steel, thuds, cracks, whistles that didn't sound like anything natural. Every volley was a question. Did we survive that one? And the answer was always, some of us did. You never knew who until the next volley came, and the one after that. The front lines couldn't retreat. Behind them were more men, more formations, and in some cases, stakes in the ground to keep them from running. So if the shield wall failed, there was nowhere to go. You were a plug in a dam, and if you burst, the flood swallowed everyone. That's why the captains yelled until their throats bled. That's why men wedged shields between their knees when their arms gave out. You didn't break the wall. You became it. There were rules. If your shield shattered, shout. If you dropped your shield, crawl. If the man next to you screamed and fell, step sideways. Fill the gap. Never look back. Never ask questions. And above all, never run. Because once one man ran, it was over. The wall fell. The enemy surged. The screams spread like fire. And everything that held the line together shattered. Sometimes the archers would pause, reposition, rearm, and in that quiet, you exhaled. Maybe for the first time in minutes. You looked around, quickly, counted heads, checked for friends, one gone, two bleeding, a new man stepping up. No one introduced themselves. There was no time, just nods, shared fear, mutual understanding. We don't have to win. We just have to hold. The wall moved when it had to. A push, a press, a slow creep forward, like a waking nightmare. Every inch gained was a risk. Every step made you more vulnerable. But you moved, because someone told you to, because the arrows were behind you now, and because standing still too long made the fear grow louder than the horns. So the next time you hear about holding the line, picture this. A wall of exhausted men, arms numb, backs aching, shields splintered, feet in blood-soaked mud, still standing, still pressing forward, because the moment they stop, everything behind them collapses. There comes a moment in every battle when all plans go up in smoke. Orders vanish, lines collapse, formations blur. And suddenly, you're not part of an army anymore. You're a man in the middle of a very loud, very messy panic. This is the breaking point. It doesn't matter what side you're on. Once the line gives out, the battlefield becomes one simple thing: chaos. And chaos doesn't care who trained harder or prayed louder. It starts small. A stumble, a hole in the shield wall, a misheard order. Then comes the ripple. A gap opens. The enemy pours in, and the ranks fold like damp parchment. You don't get a horn blast or a warning. 1 minute you're holding ground. The next, you're dodging a panicked horse and screaming for someone, anyone, to tell you what's happening. But no one does, because no one knows. That's chaos. Forget left and right. Forget where's the captain or which way's friendly. All you know now is where you don't want to be. The center of the collapse. That's where men get trampled, cornered, or cut down in the crush. It's not even a fight anymore. It's a scramble. And what saves you isn't skill. It's luck. Dumb, filthy, unfair luck. The noise becomes something else. It's no longer a rhythm of battle. It's a storm of shrieks, clanks, and sheer panic. Horses cry out. Men trip over corpses. Blades swing wild. Some soldiers drop their weapons entirely and run. Others freeze. Some lash out at anything that moves, friend or foe. You could die by the enemy's sword or your ally's elbow. Chaos has no favorites. You hear screams, some of them yours. You feel bodies slam into you. You duck, you swing, you fall, you crawl. The neat formation you were in an hour ago? Gone. Now it's just survival. You look for colors, banners, a familiar face. But everything's blurred. Everyone's filthy. And more than once, you nearly attack your own side. That's how disorienting it is. Some try to regroup. Officers yell themselves hoarse. A few brave souls wave banners, trying to rally units back into lines. Sometimes it works, but more often, it just makes them targets. The enemy's in the middle now, behind you, beside you. There's no direction that's safe. The only rule is, don't stop moving. If you stop, you're part of the pile. The ground becomes your enemy, slippery with blood, littered with limbs, shields, helmets, broken weapons. You step wrong and twist your ankle. You step right and kick a helmet full of someone's face. It's no longer a field. It's a butcher's yard. And through it all, you just keep moving. Not toward victory, just away from death. And then, suddenly, there's fire. Not from siege weapons, just something burning. Maybe a tent, maybe a tree, maybe a man. Doesn't matter. The smoke rises, the flames crackle, and the confusion deepens. Visibility drops. Breathing gets harder. You're choking, swinging blindly, shoulder to shoulder with strangers. This isn't battle anymore. It's panic in slow motion. The wounded crawl. Some scream for help. Others beg for death. Most are ignored. Not out of cruelty, just necessity. If you stop to help, you die too. Some try anyway, pulling a friend up, dragging a bleeding man away from the crush. And some succeed. Most don't. The lucky ones die quick. The unlucky ones are trampled. The truly unlucky stay conscious through the whole thing. There's a moment, if you survive long enough, where things get too chaotic. So chaotic that everything slows down. Time bends. You hear your heartbeat louder than the battlefield. Your vision tunnels. You see one man coming toward you. Not an army, not a formation, just him. You raise your weapon, he raises his. And in that instant, nothing else exists. Just this. Just now. This is what breaking points feel like. It's not cinematic. It's not dramatic. It's messy, stupid, and terrifying. No glory. No slow-mo charges. Just mud, blood, and blurred instincts trying to keep your limbs attached for 5 more seconds. And then, if you live through it, something shifts. A whistle, a horn, a cheer. Someone's rallied. A flank is held. Reinforcements arrive. Or maybe the enemy breaks first. You don't celebrate. You don't even smile. You just breathe. Because the worst didn't happen, not yet. But now comes the retreat. If chaos is the middle of the battle, retreat is the end. Just not always the planned end. Because when a medieval army broke, it didn't file out in an orderly line. It exploded. Men dropped weapons, horses bolted. Entire units turned tail and ran over whoever was in front of them. Retreat wasn't a strategy, it was a stampede. And sometimes, the thing that killed you wasn't the enemy. It was your own side, trampling you into the mud. The retreat usually started with a crack in morale. One man panicked, then 2, then 20. Someone screamed, "We're losing!" And suddenly, that idea spread like wildfire. Doesn't matter if it's true. Once fear takes root, it multiplies. You could be holding strong, but if the men beside you break and run, you're done. You can't fight in both directions, and you certainly can't stand your ground when 50 people barrel over you in blind terror. Retreats never looked like a movie scene. No formation, no banners, just exhausted men throwing down gear to move faster, ripping off helmets for air, elbowing through crowds like a fire had started. Sometimes, literally. Arrows might still be flying. Cavalry might still be charging. And you? You were trying not to get stepped on by the guy who was your shield partner 10 minutes ago. If you were in the rear, congratulations. You're the new front line, because once the retreat starts, it runs straight through you. Men who've completely lost control of their senses will shove, trip, and even knock you down just to get a few steps ahead. Your choices: join them, or get flattened. If you pause to think, you'll be breathing mud before the decision finishes forming. Some tried to keep order. Officers waved swords, screamed for calm. A few stood their ground, shouting, "We can still hold!" Sometimes it worked. Most of the time, they were ignored or run over. Occasionally, they were stabbed by their own troops for trying to stop them. Because in the chaos of a retreat, anyone slowing you down becomes the enemy. Now, the enemy loves a retreat. It's their favorite part. No more lines, no more shield walls, just backs, unprotected, fleeing, vulnerable. Archers aimed low, cavalry swept in for the kill, infantry chased and hacked at stragglers. This was when the real slaughter began. You thought the battle was bad? The retreat made it look polite. Knights were especially targeted during retreats. Heavier armor made them slower, easier to chase down, and no one wanted to leave a valuable ransom behind. So even if they tried to flee, they'd be swarmed. Some surrendered, others fought to the last. A few were dragged from their horses and killed with daggers under the chin. It wasn't noble, it wasn't clean, but it was efficient. Those too wounded to run had two choices: play dead or beg. Neither had great odds. Playing dead sometimes worked, unless someone stepped on you or poked you, just to be sure. Begging worked if you were valuable. A noble with a name might live. A farmer with no coin. No such luck. Soldiers weren't in a forgiving mood after hours of bloodshed. The terrain made things worse. Forests choked movement. Hills slowed you. Rivers killed hundreds. Men in armor drowned in waist-deep water. Bridges collapsed under weight. Carts got stuck and blocked exits. What was once a slow, steady march now turned into a jammed, frantic scramble over whatever wasn't on fire or bleeding. Sometimes, entire units turned on each other. One blamed another for retreating. Fights broke out in the rear. Arguments about who abandoned whom, punches thrown, swords drawn. Right there, mid-retreat, while the enemy bore down on them. That's how disorganized things became. Panic erased discipline, and discipline, once gone, didn't come back. When the dust settled, the lucky ones had escaped. The luckier ones had kept their boots. Some limped home in silence. Others crawled. But many, many never left the battlefield. Not because they were killed by the enemy, but because they were in the wrong place when the retreat began. Trampled, forgotten, crushed beneath the weight of other men's fear.
So, if anyone tells you retreat is the smart option, remind them. In medieval war, retreat wasn't about running. It was about surviving the avalanche that your friends became. And sometimes, surviving meant choosing between the enemy in front or the stampede behind.
So you survived the arrows, the pikes, the screaming, and the chaos. Congratulations. Now comes the part everyone forgets. The part where you don't die right away, but still very well might. Welcome to medieval battlefield medicine, where the tools are dull, the knowledge is shaky, and the best surgeon might also be your drunk cousin. You're bleeding, shaking, and praying the guy holding the knife knows which end to cut with. Let's start with the good news. If your wound was shallow and you could walk, someone might help. The bad news? Help usually involved pressing something vaguely clean against the hole, saying, "You'll be fine," and hoping you didn't pass out. There were no sterilized instruments, no antiseptics, no anesthesia. Pain wasn't managed. Pain was expected, and if it got bad enough, someone might just hand you a piece of wood to bite. Field medics were often just guys who didn't die that day. Some were trained, monks, barbers, or chirurgeons with experience. But even they operated with the knowledge of the time, which included a lot of guesswork and a strong belief in balancing your bodily humors. If your arm was sliced open, they might bleed you further to rebalance. If your leg was broken, they might set it, using a plank and a prayer. Surgery was rare and horrifying. Amputations happened, but only when absolutely necessary, like if the limb was already gangrenous or mangled beyond saving. The tools: bone saws, knives, tongs, and grit. No painkillers. Just a few strong men to hold you down while someone hacked off your limb, hopefully in one clean motion. If the blade stuck or wobbled, too bad. And after that, cauterization. That's right. Red-hot iron straight to the wound. For internal wounds, there wasn't much they could do. A punctured lung, a gut wound. Sorry. You were given water, maybe wine, and left somewhere soft to wait it out, whether that meant recovery or the slow, agonizing descent into infection. And let's not even get started on head injuries. If your skull was cracked, the best-case scenario was a piece of it getting pried out with a chisel. The worst case, you didn't wake up. Bandages weren't sterile. Cloth was reused, washed, if lucky, dried in the sun, pressed into new wounds without a second thought. Sometimes herbs were added, garlic, honey, or moldy bread, which weirdly might have helped in a "we accidentally invented antibiotics" kind of way. But most treatments were superstition over science. A poultice, a chant, a charm tucked under your tongue. If it worked, great. If not, well, you probably sinned. There was no such thing as rest and recovery. If you could stand, you were expected to keep moving. If you were a noble, maybe you got carried on a cart. If you were anyone else, you dragged yourself behind the wagons and hoped no one noticed how much blood you were leaking. There were no stretchers, no triage tents, just shaded ditches and exhausted priests trying to guess who might last the night. And infections? Constant. Wounds festered quickly. Flies found you before your friends did. A scratch today could be a fever tomorrow. Gangrene was common. Tetanus, also known as lockjaw, or that thing that made him scream until he died. No one understood germs, but everyone understood death. If a wound smelled bad, you were probably doomed. If your skin turned black, you definitely were. Sometimes, mercy took strange forms. A dagger to the heart, a slit throat. Soldiers couldn't always carry their wounded, but they didn't want to leave friends to suffer. So they made it quick. Brutal, but kind in its own way. Other times, wounded men were left behind, hidden under brush, with a kiss on the forehead and a whispered lie. "We'll come back for you." They never did. The battlefield after a fight wasn't quiet. It moaned, it cried, it bled into the dirt. Men called out for mothers, gods, or water. Some dragged themselves toward the sound of help. Others crawled into shadows and gave up. And those trying to help? They had rocks. Maybe a dull knife, maybe wine, and the shaking certainty that most of these men wouldn't make it through the night. So yes, surviving the battle was only half the fight. The other half was surviving after it, when the glory faded, the pain began, and the best tool in the medical kit was still a rock. The fighting's over. The screaming is thinned. The battlefield is quiet, but not silent. Just different. You hear the wind again. Maybe a crow, maybe a man whimpering somewhere behind a tree. The worst of it has passed. But the aftermath, that's where the real decisions start. Because as the sun lowers over the ruined field, everyone still breathing is thinking the same thing. What now? For many, the answer is simple. Loot the bodies. And try not to become one. Looting wasn't dishonorable. It was survival. A sword from a fallen knight could feed your family for a year. A ring, a coin pouch, even boots with intact soles, they all meant something. The dead didn't need their gear. But you did. And if you didn't take it, someone else would. Fast. Looting started before the blood dried, before the flies landed, sometimes even before the men stopped twitching. It wasn't personal. It was just part of the routine. You stepped carefully, not out of respect, out of fear. Not all the bodies were dead. Some were pretending. You'd nudge a man with your foot, watching for breath, for a twitch. If he moved, you finished the job or kept walking. No time for mercy, no room for risk. Other looters weren't so cautious. They stabbed first, searched second. If you were playing dead, you had to really commit. Playing dead was a gamble. You smeared yourself in someone else's blood. Maybe yours, maybe not. You lay still, unblinking, breathing shallow. You let the looters pass, let them pick your pockets. Sometimes you even let them take your boots. Pride meant nothing when survival was on the table. You hoped they moved on. You hoped no one stabbed you just to check. And you hoped the real dead didn't roll over onto you mid-loot. Not everyone looted. Some prayed. Some searched for friends or what was left of them. A few were sent to retrieve the wounded. But most, once the fighting was done, knew the spoils were all that remained. Battle wasn't just about territory. It was about equipment, about wealth, about scavenging what was once someone else's future. It was brutal arithmetic. Your death, my bread. The nobler corpses drew the biggest crowds. A fallen knight was a treasure chest, fine mail, ornate daggers, purses with actual coins. His body would be stripped fast, right there in the mud. No ceremony. Just hands tearing away layers. Even his horse, if still breathing, might be dragged off. The war didn't care about bloodlines. A corpse in armor was just a payday waiting to happen. Weapons were traded on the spot. A sword too heavy for you might fetch food later. A helm was bartered for wine. Someone's heirloom axe became tomorrow's firewood. The camp came alive with hushed deals and dirty hands. Soldiers haggled over loot like merchants in a back alley. And no one asked where it came from. Everyone already knew. Of course, looting was dangerous. There were still patrols, officers cracking down, men accused of taking from the wrong body, the wrong side. Fights broke out, knives drawn, blood spilled over men who were already bled dry. You could survive a battle and still die over a boot that didn't even fit. That was the kind of stupid death the battlefield saved just for the greedy. Sometimes you found more than loot. A locket with a face inside, a half-written letter, a child's ribbon tied to a dagger hilt. You took those too. Not because they were valuable, but because they reminded you briefly that the man you stripped had been someone. Then you pocketed it, because even grief could be sold if wrapped in silver or gold. As night fell, the field shimmered with ghostlight, torches, lanterns, bits of armor reflecting moonlight. It looked peaceful, from a distance, but walk close and you'd hear the rustle of hands in pockets, the shuffle of bodies turned over, the clink of stolen blades. You'd hear whispers, heavy breathing, and maybe if you were quiet, the sudden gasp of someone realizing the corpse they were looting was still alive. In the end, the battlefield didn't belong to the winners. It belonged to the looters, to the desperate, to the half-dead trying not to blink. It wasn't over until the last ring was taken, the last knife pulled, the last man stopped pretending. And by then, the field wasn't a place of battle anymore. It was a market, a morgue, and if you weren't careful, a trap. Rain didn't wait for battles to end. In fact, it often showed up during them, uninvited, cold, and laughing in medieval. If you've never fought in the rain, imagine slipping in wet socks while someone throws knives at your face. Now imagine that for 6 hours, on a slope, surrounded by screaming. Weather didn't just complicate medieval warfare, it ruined it. Strategy crumbled, morale drowned, and somewhere in the fog, a commander quietly cried. Let's start with visibility. Fog was nature's favorite prank. 1 minute, you could see your enemy lined up across the field. The next, they'd vanished, swallowed by gray mist that clung to your armor like regret. Commanders gave orders into the void. Units got lost. Some armies literally walked past each other without realizing it. You think you're flanking the enemy, and it turns out you've circled back and are now flanking your own latrines. Rain turned firm soil into soup. Shields slipped from hands. Horses panicked. Spears got heavy. Every step forward was a gamble. Do you lunge or do you slide? Will you find footing or your face in the mud? Men slipped, fell, and were trampled before a sword was ever drawn. You could die from a sprained ankle and a poorly timed boot. And if you landed wrong, your helmet filled with mud faster than you could cough. Armor soaked up water like a sponge in denial. Gambesons, those thick padded jackets worn under mail, became 20-pound soggy towels glued to your ribs. Chainmail rusted, leather warped, your sword grip turned to mush. And if you were lucky enough to have a plume on your helmet, congratulations. It now looked like a drowned rat taped to your skull. Arrows were a mess in the rain. Strings lost tension, feathers warped. Arrows veered off course or dropped early. Archers swore a lot. Some tried to dry their strings under cloaks. Others used candles, which led to predictable and hilarious disasters. Meanwhile, crossbows, slower but more weather-resistant, suddenly became the MVPs of the field. Until they jammed, which they did. Often. Cavalry? Forget it. Horses hated mud. They slipped. They refused to charge. Some just laid down mid-battle like, nope. A panicked horse in a storm was a missile without a target. Entire cavalry charges failed because the ground simply didn't cooperate. Hooves flailed, riders flipped, and in the end, it was a night versus gravity. Gravity usually won. Even marching was miserable. Rain-soaked maps, ruined gunpowder, and turned travel into a slog. Armies moved slower, lost gear, and got sick. Wet boots meant blisters. Wet tents meant no sleep, and wet food meant no food at all. A hungry, cold soldier doesn't care about discipline. He cares about fire and dry socks. And since he has neither, he mostly just mutters threats at the sky. Wind added insult to injury. It turned smoke into a blinding, choking mess. It flung arrows off course. It whipped banners into faces and blew tents away mid-meal. 1 minute, you're planning an ambush. The next, your entire signal system is fluttering behind a bush like a defeated parade float. Commanders tried to adjust. The weather didn't care. Morale plummeted with the temperature. Men cursed the sky, cursed their leaders, and especially cursed that one guy who said, "It doesn't look like rain." Cold crept into joints. Fingers stopped bending. You couldn't hold a weapon properly. You couldn't feel your toes. Your nose ran freely into your beard, and your beard froze to your chest. The enemy wasn't terrifying. Pneumonia was. And yet, battles still happened. Schedules didn't wait. Food supplies didn't last. So men fought anyway, in the rain, in the fog, in the freezing sludge. They slipped and stabbed and shouted through chattering teeth. They died soaked and miserable. Not from enemy blows, but from exposure, from hypothermia, from collapsing in a ditch they didn't see because everything looked like a ditch. Afterward, the field was worse. Mud and blood blended into a slippery soup. Looters lost boots in the muck. Corpses floated in shallow puddles. Wounded men shivered until they stopped moving. No one sang songs about it. No one painted it. Because fighting in bad weather wasn't glorious. It was just one more layer of suffering, one more reminder that nature was a more patient killer than any sword. Let's get one thing straight. Nature was not your ally. In medieval warfare, the weather didn't just make you uncomfortable. It tried to kill you. And sometimes it did a better job than the enemy. The seasons were brutal. The terrain got worse when it rained, froze, or baked. And your gear? Not designed for any of it. A knight might survive a sword, but a week of cold toes? That was his real villain origin story. Mud was its own battlefield. It swallowed boots. It flipped carts. It turned steady footing into a medieval slip and slide of doom. Soldiers lost entire shoes trying to cross a field. Some even lost legs, not in the gory sense, but because they sank waist deep and couldn't get out. If the enemy didn't get you, the mud probably would. And if you fell face first in it during a charge, good luck ever getting up again. Mud also had a special hatred for siege equipment. Battering rams bogged down, ladders slipped sideways, catapults sank, horses pulling supply carts strained until they collapsed in exhaustion or rage, and those carefully laid battle formations, useless. Troops had to shuffle, trip, and guess where the road used to be. Half the battle became just figuring out how to walk without pulling a hamstring. Winter had its own horrors. Frostbite wasn't a maybe. It was expected. Fingers, toes, ears, anything exposed could blacken, rot, or fall off. Soldiers stuffed straw in their boots for insulation. Some used dead rats as makeshift hand warmers. You laugh, but warmth was warmth. At night, men huddled together for heat, which sounds noble until you wake up frozen to your comrade's backside like a pair of human popsicles. Armor in the cold was a metal coffin. Touch it with bare hands, your skin stuck. Chainmail froze stiff. Helmets frosted over on the inside. Visibility dropped. So did morale. Soldiers tried to start fires, but wet wood meant smoke and failure. And heaven help you if snow started falling mid-battle. Visibility vanished, movement slowed, and your enemy turned into vague, stabbing snowmen. Then there was spring, everyone's favorite disease season. Melting snow turned fields into slush pits. Pollen triggered sneezing fits mid-charge. And the ground? Still frozen 2 inches down, but slick on the surface. You couldn't ride. You couldn't march. All you could do was slide very bravely toward your doom and hope the guy next to you didn't trip and take you with him. But summer was a different kind of misery. Heat strokes swept through camps faster than any arrow volley. Men in heavy armor roasted like rotisserie chickens. You could hear them cooking inside their plate. Sweat pooled in boots. Helmets became saunas. Dehydration turned veterans into dizzy, sunburned ghosts. And when you did get water, it was usually warm, stale, and shared with 3 other people. Delicious. Plague and rot thrived in heat. Wounds festered faster. Meat spoiled. Water turned green. The smell of a summer battlefield was the stuff of legend. Rot, blood, body heat, and despair. Flies formed clouds. Maggots showed up before you were cold. And sleeping was almost impossible unless you liked sharing your pillow with 10,000 mosquitoes. Weather wasn't just a side effect. It was a weapon. Commanders planned around it, or at least tried. Some battles were delayed because of fog. Others happened because the enemy looked tired from the rain. A surprise storm could swing an entire campaign. Roads washed out. Rivers swelled. One wrongly timed thunderclap, panic, confusion, retreat, and all you could do was yell at the sky, as if it cared. And yet, despite all this, soldiers fought on, in sleet, in drought, in sideways hail, because orders were orders, and death by enemy sword looked a lot cleaner than death by trench foot and regret. The enemy had steel, but nature had everything else, and it didn't pick sides, it just waited, cold, wet, unforgiving. So if you imagine medieval battlefields as fields of glory, stop. Picture frostbitten fingers on sword hilts. Picture men face down in mud, stuck like fence posts. Picture sweat pouring off a knight's back under a relentless sun. Because weather didn't just influence battles. Sometimes it won them. History books don't come with scratch and sniff. And honestly, that's a blessing. Because if they did, you'd close them forever. Medieval battlefields didn't just look awful. They smelled like a cursed stew of everything that could rot, burn, sweat, bleed, and die. No breeze, no candle, no fragrant herb pouch could mask it. Victory? Glory? No. What you actually won was a front row seat to the worst smelling place in the known world. Start with the obvious. Blood. Not just a drop here and there. Buckets, gallons. Blood soaked the grass, pooled in boot prints sprayed across shields, And blood doesn't smell like movie drama. It's thick, metallic, like hot iron cooked with copper coins. You smell it in your mouth. It clings to your nose. Once you've inhaled the battlefield's blood perfume, you never forget it. It lives in your beard, your tunic, your dreams. Then there's sweat. Imagine thousands of bodies, nervous, armored, sun-baked bodies, jammed into one space, breathing heavily, running, swinging weapons, grunting, falling. Every soldier had their own unique brand of stink, wool soaked in fear, socks never washed, breath like bad cheese and desperation. Combine them, and you get a human miasma thick enough to chew. And speaking of human, let's talk waste. Soldiers relieved themselves before battle, when they could. But during, all bets were off. Men soiled themselves mid-charge. Wounded men lost control. Dead men leaked everything. The ground didn't just drink blood. It drank everything. So yes, urine, feces, vomit, all present, all accounted for, and all marinating in the midday sun like the world's worst soup. Horses contributed, of course. They sweated, bled, and, like their riders, frequently panicked their way into gastrointestinal issues. A dying horse smells specific, like sour meat mixed with wet hay and engine oil, if engine oil existed. Some horses burst open, others lay bloated, their bowels emptied, their teeth locked in silent horror. A battlefield without dead horses doesn't exist. A battlefield that smells like one absolutely does. Burnt flesh is a smell no one forgets. Whether from fire arrows, boiling pitch, or unfortunate proximity to a torch, burn injuries created a new layer of olfactory trauma. It's sweet and sick at the same time, like roasting pork, but wrong. Deeply wrong. When your brain recognizes the smell but your gut tells you to run, that's battlefield barbecue. And it haunted survivors more than any sword swing. Rot set in fast. By evening, wounds already festered. Corpses began to bloat and split. Flies gathered in clouds. The air buzzed with insect wings and decay. If it rained, even worse. The mud trapped the smell and released it like burps from a very angry swamp. You didn't just walk across a battlefield. You waded through a slow-motion compost pile in human form. And let's not forget the smell of fear. Yes, fear has a smell. It's sour, musky, and impossible to ignore. Pungent sweat, stale breath. Skin that hasn't been washed in weeks, now drenched in pure adrenaline. It wafts off men in waves before the first clash even starts. Some say they could tell who would break ranks just by the stench. Not poetic, but very accurate. Clothing absorbed everything. Soldiers reeked long after the fighting stopped. Helmets stank of breath and rot. Boots held mud, blood, and worse. Even soap, if you had any, couldn't touch it. Veterans joked that you could smell a battlefield survivor before you saw him. And they weren't wrong. It clung to your pores, your hair, your soul. There was no escaping it. Only surviving it. The wind didn't help. Sometimes it spread the stench, carrying it toward nearby villages or the enemy camp. Other times it circled back, stuffing the smell right into your lungs every time you tried to breathe deep. You learned to mouth breathe, or tie a rag around your face, or just accept that everything smelled like death dipped in latrine water. And yet, after hours or days, your nose adjusted. That was the worst part. You stopped noticing. The horror didn't leave. It just became normal. You sat in it, slept near it, ate beside it. You adapted, not because you were strong, but because you had to. Because medieval war didn't just break bodies, it broke noses, and then made them live in it. When the battle ends, the living leave, the dying groan. And the field, it becomes someone else's kingdom. Not the victors, not the dead. No, the new rulers arrive on wings and paws. First the flies, then the dogs. And after that, a long, slow decay where the silence buzzes louder than any war horn. No one sings about it. No one writes ballads about what happens next. But it's real, it's ugly, and it's always waiting. The flies always came first. You could hear them before you saw them. A low, droning hum that grew by the hour. They circled in clouds, blackening the air, landing on wounds, eyes, mouths. They didn't care if a man was dead or just unconscious. If he wasn't moving, he was food. They laid eggs in gashes, crawled under armor, swarmed over every patch of exposed skin like they owned it. And by now, they did. Flies meant trouble, infection, rot, sickness. They danced between corpses and survivors, spreading disease as they went. Soldiers waved them off, cursed at them, even tried to outrun them. Didn't matter. Flies could find you anywhere. And if you passed out, they found your open mouth, your bloody nose, your missing finger. They filled every crevice with wings and eggs and the promise of worse things to come. Then came the dogs, not war dogs, not trained companions, just local strays, half wild and always hungry. They sniffed out the battlefield long before the final screams faded. Some came alone, some in packs. Some wagged their tails and looked friendly until they tore into a corpse like it was Sunday dinner. They didn't bark. They didn't growl. They just ate, quietly, thoroughly, and without fear. The dogs were scavengers, not villains. They didn't know glory or sides. They knew blood, fat, open bellies. They gnawed through leather straps, yanked limbs free of armor, fought each other over the soft parts. And if a man moved, just a twitch. The pack paused, watched, waited. If he didn't move again, they went back to work. If he did, they backed off, for now. Sometimes, soldiers returning to loot the dead would find a dog already there, face deep in what used to be a chest cavity. Some tried to chase them off. Others let them finish. The smart ones waited until the dog moved on. No sense getting bit over someone else's rib cage. And besides, if the dog was eating, it meant the man was truly dead. Nature's confirmation stamp. Carrion birds joined the feast soon after. Crows, ravens, vultures, depending on the region. They circled overhead, waiting for quiet, then descended in flapping waves, pecking at faces, pulling out eyes, stripping cheeks of flesh. They were efficient, ruthless, unbothered. They'd fight over a severed hand like it was a juicy plum. Soldiers joked that crows knew battle schedules better than any general. The combination of dogs, birds, and flies turned the battlefield into a grotesque buffet. By sunset, bodies swelled and burst. Gases escaped, skin discolored, helmets hid horrors. And the noise, the chewing, flapping, buzzing, never stopped. It filled your ears. It followed you back to camp. It got stuck in your dreams. The battlefield didn't just kill your friends, it ate them while you watched. Or worse, while you walked away. Cleanup wasn't a given. If the victors had time, they might bury their own. The rest left where they fell. Some were dragged into pits, some were set on fire, others were simply ignored. After a week, even armor couldn't hide the rot. Bones poked through chainmail, eyes melted, fingers curled and hardened like old roots. What was once a man became a warning. Don't come back here. And yet sometimes people did come back. Farmers, grave diggers, kids with wagons collecting scrap. They found bones, teeth, coins clutched in dead hands. Sometimes they found entire skeletons still sitting up, propped against trees, waiting for something that never came. And they found the dogs, now fat, now lazy, now licking blood from their paws like nothing had happened at all. In stories, the battlefield ends with cheering, with victory. But in truth, it ends with buzzing, barking, silence, and a stink that lasts for weeks. The flies come first, the dogs follow, and whatever name the battle had, it fades. All that's left is a field full of things that were once alive, and a sky full of wings waiting for the next one. Once the swords were sheathed and the looting slowed, someone had to deal with what was left behind. Not just the weapons, Not just the blood-stained banners, but the bodies, dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands. And there was no system for it. No military protocol. Just men handed shovels and told, "Start digging." That was the true end of battle. Not a trumpet. A trench. Not glory. Just a grave. Shared, shallow, and rushed. Grave duty was no honor. It was punishment or necessity. You'd fought all morning, maybe looted all afternoon, and now you were up to your elbows in wet earth and rotting friends. No one volunteered. If you were wounded but still walking, guess what? You were the new undertaker. If you'd survived without a scratch, congratulations. You were strong enough to carry bodies. Everyone hated it. And everyone did it. Sometimes they dug proper pits. Deep, long, straight. If the ground was soft, if there was time, if leadership actually cared. Most of the time, they didn't. Graves were shallow, lined with whoever was closest. Bodies stacked like firewood. Friend and foe together, armor stripped, faces half gone. No markers, no prayers. Just a few curses, a shovel jabbed into the ribs, and a hope that no one came back up overnight. The smell made things worse. You thought the battlefield during the fight was bad. Try working it the next day. Every hour made the bodies riper, swollen, leaking. Skins slipped off like wet parchment. Eyes bulged. Mouths hung open. Some still groaned. Not alive, just air escaping. That didn't make it less terrifying when one suddenly hissed like a boiling kettle while you tried to roll it into a hole. Identifying the dead? Only if you had the stomach for it, or a strong nose. Helmets were removed. Tunics searched for insignias. Faces, if still intact, studied briefly. And then someone would nod. That's Thomas. That's the blacksmith's boy. That's the one who screamed about chickens before charging. You remembered what you could. You forgot what you had to. And if you didn't know a name, you didn't ask. Counting the dead was its own nightmare. Officers kept lists, or tried to. But the math never added up. Some bodies were missing heads. Others had more than one next to them. Some were in pieces too scattered to properly count. There were entire units that seemed to vanish, swallowed by chaos or terrain. When in doubt, someone guessed. Call it 400. Make it 5. No one double-checked. Sometimes the enemy offered truces. A day to bury the dead. No fighting, just digging. Men who were trying to kill each other the day before now passed shovels, nodded silently, and heaved bodies into the same pits. It was surreal, quiet, haunting. And then, as soon as the sun set, the truce ended, and the stabbing resumed. As if nothing had just happened. As if you hadn't just buried someone who looked exactly like you. If there was clergy present, you might get a blessing, a sign of the cross, a muttered Latin prayer. But most fields were priestless, too far from chapels, too full of doubt. Men prayed in whispers, or cursed, or said nothing. They just dug, wiped sweat from their brows, and kept count on their fingers. 1, 2, 17, 43. Too many. Always too many. Animals complicated things. Dogs, scavengers, birds. They pulled up corpses as fast as you buried them. A shallow grave meant nothing to a hungry beast. Some soldiers staked down the dead, others covered them with rocks. But time and teeth did their work. A week later, the same field might bloom with bones again. No battlefield stayed buried forever. By the end of the cleanup, most soldiers were numb. They didn't cry, they didn't rage, they just moved on. Some joked about it, called the dead meat, gave nicknames to corpses, laughed too loudly. Because that's what it took to keep moving. If you thought too hard about the body in your arms, you stopped. And if you stopped, the bodies kept coming. So when people say medieval battles were brief, an afternoon, a few hours, they're forgetting this part. The days of digging, the weeks of counting, the months of remembering or trying not to. War didn't end when the fighting stopped. It ended when the last shovel hit dirt. And even then, not really. So, who won? It's the question everyone asks when the swords go quiet and the dead stop moving. But in medieval battles, that answer wasn't always obvious. Was it the side still standing? The side that kept the hill? Or the side that technically lost fewer men? Victory didn't always look like cheering soldiers and waving banners. Sometimes it looked like a muddy field, a confused commander, and a grim calculation. Was that worth it? You might have taken the field, but at what cost? Half your army limps, your rations are gone, your horses are dead, and your best knight has an arrow where his future used to be. The enemy retreated, sure, but they'll be back in a week, and now they know exactly where your weak spots are. Winning could mean surviving slightly longer than the other guy. That's not victory, that's endurance. Sometimes the side that held the field didn't declare victory at all. Why? Because they were so battered, so disorganized, that holding ground meant nothing. They couldn't press forward, they couldn't pursue. They couldn't even bury their dead without collapsing from exhaustion. And worse, everyone back home expected a parade, not a wagon full of widows. The loser? Well, they didn't always feel like they lost. Maybe they fell back with most of their army intact. Maybe they inflicted more casualties. Maybe they just lived to fight another day with better positioning. And sometimes, a tactical retreat spun into legend. History has a funny habit of romanticizing retreats when the writer has a soft spot for the guy who ran away. Medieval chroniclers played fast and loose with the facts. If your side paid the scribe, you won, no matter how badly the day actually went. Glorious withdrawal, heroic delay, divine test of patience. All phrases used to make a chaotic defeat sound like part of a master plan. You could lose half your army and still get a glowing write-up, especially if the other guy was excommunicated. Victory wasn't always decided on the battlefield anyway. Sometimes it happened weeks later, when reinforcements arrived, or when word spread, or when the survivors rebuilt faster. Political alliances, coin, morale, supply chains, they all mattered. And a smaller loss today might secure a larger win tomorrow, or not, depending on the weather, and the king's mood, and the local pig population. Seriously, soldiers didn't care about strategic objectives. They cared about boots that fit and bread that didn't move on its own. After battle, most didn't know if they'd won. They only knew if they were alive, if their friends were dead, and whether their commander was smiling or swearing. Glory was abstract, but a good meal? That was real. The people back home were often fed whatever version of the story made leadership look competent. A crushing triumph might just mean we didn't die quite as fast as expected. A noble sacrifice often meant someone forgot the supply wagons. The spin was fast, the memory short. By the time the truth reached the towns, it had already been rewritten to fit the song. And even when you did win clearly, took the castle, captured the nobles, routed the enemy, there was the aftermath. Keeping what you'd taken, feeding your wounded, surviving winter. A clear victory in the field didn't always mean lasting peace. Sometimes it meant painting a target on your back. Congrats! You won! Now hold that for the next decade while everyone tries to take it from you. The grim truth? Most medieval battles didn't have satisfying conclusions. They weren't final. They were violent pauses in a much longer argument. Kings kept fighting, lords kept scheming, and the same fields were soaked in blood again the following spring. Winning just meant you bought time. Losing meant you paid in bodies. And sometimes both sides walked away wondering what it was all for. So, who won? History might say one name, the songs might praise another. But if you were there, covered in grime, missing 2 fingers, and wondering if you'd ever taste fresh bread again, the only answer that mattered was simple. I'm still alive. And in medieval war, that was the only victory most men ever got to claim. If you think medieval battles were accurately recorded, think again. The people writing the history, monks, scribes, court poets, weren't neutral. They were on a payroll. And that meant the story had to serve the crown, not the facts. If a king wanted to be remembered as a glorious commander, the chroniclers made it so. Even if he spent the whole battle hiding behind a tree and screaming at pigeons. Ink obeyed gold. Kings didn't just win battles, they won them harder on parchment. Victories were exaggerated. Defeats became tactical retreats. Even disasters could be framed as divine tests of strength. Did the army lose half its men? The scribe would write, "We were purified in fire and rose stronger." Translation, it was a disaster, but nobody wanted to get beheaded for saying so. These chroniclers knew their audience. They weren't writing for future historians. They were writing for nobles who liked to read about themselves punching fate in the face. So the stories were tailored. The king rode in shining armor, rallied the troops with a single shout, and cut down 5 enemies with one swing. In reality, he might have been nursing a hangover and fell off his horse mid-prayer. Facts were flexible, numbers especially. If the king had 5,000 men, the enemy had 50,000. If 5 knights died, they were martyrs. If 500 peasants died, they weren't worth mentioning. Light casualties, the record would say, even if the field looked like a butcher's yard. Medieval statistics were more storytelling than math, and they always made one side look chosen by God. Divine intervention was the go-to explanation for everything. Did the king survive a near-death experience? Miracle. Did an archer hit the enemy general? Guided by the Lord. Did it rain just in time to ruin the enemy's supply lines? Heaven clearly favored the righteous. The truth, luck, terrain, and dumb chance, was far less poetic, but poetry sold better. Chroniclers also rewrote geography. Hills became mountains, streams became rivers. A slightly inconvenient slope became the treacherous heights of destiny. These weren't lies, exactly. They were dramatic enhancements, like adding slow motion to someone tripping and calling it a dance with fate. Accuracy didn't stand a chance. Even names got an upgrade. Cowardly nobles were called bold but outnumbered. Reckless charges became heroic offensives. If a commander got his men lost in a swamp, the record would say, he cleverly redirected his forces through terrain the enemy could not follow. Sure, they drowned, but they drowned strategically. Peasants didn't get names. They barely got mention. Unless one did something unbelievable, like slay a noble with a pitchfork, he'd be called a nameless warrior favored by destiny. Otherwise, the records focused on knights, lords, and kings. The people who actually filled the front lines were background noise, disposable extras in someone else's victory monologue. And don't forget the artwork. Illuminated manuscripts showed orderly lines, clean armor, and proud horses. No mud, no gore, no screaming. Everyone looked like they were politely dueling over a chessboard. Meanwhile, the real battlefield smelled like a butcher's nightmare and looked like a meat puzzle exploded. But that wouldn't fit in a gold-trimmed margin. So the next time you read about a medieval battle in glowing terms, remember, it was curated, edited, polished. The story you're reading was sponsored by someone who wanted to look taller in paintings. And if a few thousand missing corpses or a fictional victory helped that along, the chroniclers were happy to oblige. After all, they wrote history, and they knew who was paying for the ink. In medieval warfare, numbers weren't facts. They were suggestions, inflated, deflated, rounded, or pulled from thin air. The chroniclers recording battles weren't statisticians. They were hype men. And numbers? They made victories bigger, defeats smaller, and enemies more terrifying than they actually were. A battle could involve 2,000 men, but the final scroll would claim 20,000. Because nothing says epic triumph like creative accounting. Let's say your side won. Great. But not dramatically enough? No problem. Just multiply the enemy's forces by 5. We were outnumbered 10 to 1, the records would say. Maybe it was closer to 3 to 2. Maybe it was dead even. Didn't matter. All that mattered was that your king looked like he walked into hell and came out flossing on a pile of corpses. And if your side lost, well, that wasn't your fault. The enemy had unbelievable numbers. We fought bravely against 40,000 infidels. Reality check. The enemy had 6,000 tired, hungry men and a goat with a limp. But that wouldn't look good in a song. So they inflated the enemy's size until defeat looked noble. We were overwhelmed by shadows, they'd write. Sure. But mostly, you were overwhelmed by bad planning and trench foot. Casualty counts were also suspect. If 1,000 soldiers died, the report said 200. If 1,000 enemy soldiers died, the report said 3,000, or too many to count, which is code for, we stopped trying to be honest 5 pages ago. Death tolls weren't meant to inform. They were meant to impress, or excuse, or distract from the fact that half the army died chasing the wrong flag. Some battles had no numbers at all, just vague language. A great many perished. Few survived to tell the tale. The ground was soaked in blood, all true-ish, all impossible to measure. Sometimes that was because the bodies were never counted. Other times, because the guy writing the chronicle had no idea what happened and didn't want to look bad. Vague drama was better than saying, we forgot to count. Prisoners? Also inflated. Capturing enemy nobles was valuable, so chroniclers made sure everyone knew how many were taken, even if it was none. We captured 20 enemy knights, the scroll declares. The truth? They captured one guy who claimed to be a knight but actually sharpened arrows for a living. But hey, it sounded good. Even armies that never fought were given bloated figures, just to sound intimidating. The enemy marched with 15,000 men. In reality, they camped with maybe 2,000, half of whom were cooks, drunk or dead from dysentery. Numbers gave weight. Weight gave fear. Fear gave kings excuses. We need more taxes. Look how big their army is. The math was less about truth and more about permission to spend. And then there were the miracle numbers. Battles where a small force miraculously defeated an army 10 times its size. These stories spread fast. They weren't just war records. They were propaganda. Proof that God was on your side, or fate, or destiny. Never mind that the small force had better terrain, sharper weapons, and leadership that didn't forget where north was. Medieval people weren't stupid, but they also weren't at the battle. Most couldn't read. Those who could trusted scribes, priests, and bards to tell them what happened, and those folks had stories to sell. Our brave king led 500 men to crush 5,000 enemies. Whether or not he even showed up was a detail lost in the footnotes, if there were footnotes. So if you ever wonder how 2 armies of 20,000 men could clash repeatedly across a tiny kingdom without depopulating it, there's your answer. They didn't. The numbers lied, the scrolls exaggerated, and history, like any good marketing campaign, knew that nothing sells like a little numerical fantasy. Next time you see a grand medieval battle claim, cut the numbers in half. Then, cut them again. Somewhere in there, you'll find the truth. Covered in mud, missing a boot, and wondering why everyone keeps insisting it was the greatest victory in living memory. The battle ended, the smoke cleared, the bodies were buried, or weren't, and the survivors, they went home. At least their bodies did. But their minds, not so much. Medieval warfare left marks that didn't bleed, scars that didn't show. You didn't need a word like trauma to know when a man came back different, quieter, angrier, or lost in a silence no song could fill. Everyone saw it. No one knew what to call it. Soldiers came home limping, hunched, or missing parts of themselves. Fingers, eyes, ears, voices too. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others started talking to things that weren't there. Wives noticed. Children noticed. Neighbors nodded and said, "He's been to war." And that was that. No help, no treatment, just nods, crossed arms, and an extra seat left empty at church, just in case he needed space. Nightmares were common. Men screamed in their sleep. Some slept outside, too afraid of walls. Others woke ready to fight, fists clenched around ghosts. Some drank too much. Others fasted for days. Some wept over spilled wine as if it were blood. There was no diagnosis, no remedy, only coping. Some turned to God. Some turned to the bottle. Some just wandered until no one recognized them anymore. The songs helped, or tried to. Bards sang of glory, of victory, of brave men who held the line. But veterans rarely sang along. They stared into the fire while others clapped. They remembered the screaming, not the rhyme. Some ballads turned real pain into catchy verses. And Sir Thomas fell with a laugh in his throat. Funny thing, no one remembered Sir Thomas laughing, just choking. Superstition filled the gap. Some said haunted men had seen too much. Others said demons followed them home from the battlefield. You could spot the marked ones, they claimed, those who didn't flinch at thunder or blink at blood. Some said they never really came home, just left their skin behind and walked around in it, like a shell. Even nobles weren't immune. Kings came back changed. Commanders turned paranoid. Some ordered random executions for cowardice when their own nerves couldn't calm. Others took vows of silence, or went on pilgrimages that lasted years. Battle didn't just bend the poor, it bent the powerful too, just more quietly. There were no therapists, no understanding, just time if you had enough of it. And even then, healing was a coin toss. Some men recovered, slowly. Others broke later, years down the line after a loud bang or a child's scream. The war never really left. It just faded enough to hide. Medieval minds didn't need clinical terms to know something was wrong. They just didn't have tools to fix it. So they sang, they prayed, they drank, and sometimes they didn't come back at all. Even if their feet touched home soil, armor gleams, horns blare, flags ripple in slow motion. That's how we picture medieval war. Noble, heroic, cinematic. But why? After everything, mud, blood, trauma, why does this brutal mess still get dressed up like a costume party? Maybe because the truth is harder to swallow. Maybe because we like our nightmares with a filter. Or maybe because glamour is easier to sell than reality, especially when you're telling stories centuries later. The myths started early. Chroniclers, poets, priests, they crafted the narrative. Not for accuracy, but for legacy. No one wanted to read about dysentery and trench foot. They wanted legends, men who charged fearlessly, kings who didn't flinch, heroes who didn't cry. The mess got scrubbed out. The blood, metaphor, the screaming, left on the cutting room floor. By the time it reached parchment, war was beautiful. Then came the paintings. Art didn't show panic. It showed poise. Warriors frozen mid-glory, faces serene even as arrows flew. Pain didn't sell portraits, pride did. And as centuries passed, the violence blurred into symbol. A knight charging meant courage. A siege meant strategy. The mud? Never painted. The stench? No brush could capture it. So it vanished, erased, on purpose. Stories helped too. Bards told tales by firelight. The brave, the bold, the ones who held the gate. They didn't mention the butcher who died in his first swing, or the boy trampled before drawing his sword. Tragedy became timing. Every loss had purpose. Every death, a line in the song. The truth that most deaths were random, too ugly, too chaotic, so it became poetry instead. Even today, we fall for it. Movies slow down the sword swings, add rousing music. Heroes ride in with spotless armor and perfect teeth. We cheer because it's neat, because it's safe, because no one's kneecap is hanging off or crying for their mother. War becomes a stage. A clean, choreographed ballet of violence where the audience never smells the blood. But here's the thing. Glamour doesn't make the truth disappear. It just hides it under a shiny helmet. The real battlefield was chaos, screaming, terror, luck. And too often, the wrong man died first. The heroes, they got lice. The kings, they panicked. The survivors, they carried ghosts. But that version doesn't make a good painting or sell many tickets. Still, we keep telling the stories. Not to glamorize, but to understand. To remind ourselves that courage and cruelty often share the same muddy ground. And that war isn't just what happens in armor. It's what stays long after the swords are dropped. So yes, we still glamorize medieval war, but maybe we can start looking closer, past the gleam, past the legend, and see what really happened in the mud. So, next time someone says they wish they lived in medieval times, maybe ask them how they feel about mud in their teeth, a spear through the gut, and no name on the record. The past wasn't cleaner. It was just bloodier up close. Thanks for coming along on this grim, muddy march through history. If you made it through all 13 chapters, you earned your place by the fire. Until next time, stay curious and stay alive.